Luk Senegers е универзитетски професор од Холандија, кој предава на повеќе универзитети во својата земја, меѓутоа и во земји на Европската Унија. Деновиве тој е гости на Центарот за истражувачко новинарство СКУП Македонија, а по повод промоција на прирачникот за новинари и истражувачи, истражување врз основа на постоечка приказна. Во ово неделното интервју со професорот Сенегерс разговараме за новинарството, слободата на говорот, но и за студентите и студентските стандарди. Добре дојдовте, професоре, во Македонија. Имавте можност да се запознаете со условите во кои што работат македонските новинари, а вие сте добар познавач и на условите во кои што работат новинарите во Европа. Кои се вашите први впечатоци?
Striking actually is the fact that everybody in this country can call himself or herself a journalist. And apparently there are no regulations for who is a journalist and who is not a journalist. And this is exactly the same as in my country actually. In my country, in the Netherlands, and in most European, Western European countries, there is no, you're not safeguarded as a journalist, meaning that everybody can call himself or herself a journalist. But I think the big difference between the situation in this part of Europe and the Western part, where the tradition of media is a bit older, of free media, is the level of professionalism of these journalists. Let me explain. There are, in my country, no regulations for journalists how to work. Okay, there are some ethical codes for journalists, but there is actually no penalty if you don't oblige to these codes. There's no penalty. There is a council for journalists, an independent council, like you have since recently here in Macedonia, which is a good thing. People can go there and complain about things in the newspaper or on television, and then they will try to mediate between the journalist and the... But I think the big difference between your country and my country is that journalists in the Netherlands are trained to be thoughtful, serious journalists in a way that they learn a lot of unwritten rules in the curriculum. Like, for example, they learn in university that if some party is accused of something, then you cannot just publish the accusation. You have to go to the accused party and ask them to respond on the accusation to balance your reporting. This is just one example of an unwritten rule, okay? And so when these students start working, well, let's say 90% of them will oblige this rule because they think this is what it means to be a journalist. It means to be impartial, it means to be fair to both parties that you are writing about. So in this circumstance, probably you don't need regulation.
Дали мислите дека можеби ниските плати, притисокот на власта и мокините луѓе не се исто така причина за страв, за затварање и непочитување на професионалните стандарди?
Yes, there is the wages, of course, for journalists here are also relatively lower than in the Netherlands. Of course, the standard of living is more expensive in Western Europe than it is here, but relatively, I think the wages they pay to journalists are too low. I mean, if you consider journalism to be a profession, and even a necessary profession in a democracy, then you should pay people a professional wage, okay? And in return for this wage, if you pay them reasonable, in turn you can ask from these journalists that they will behave reasonable. So it's a two-way system, isn't it? If you pay people reasonably, you can expect them to behave reasonably. And in Europe there is certainly pressure from the government. I mean, look at what's happening in the United Kingdom. Over the recent years they have had a lot of problems where the government actually tried to interfere in journalism. And interestingly, the UK is a good example of a Western European country with a long tradition of journalism, of freedom of the press, where they actually made regulation recently. But this regulation is aiming to get to make journalists aware of their responsibilities so that they don't eavesdrop on victims, for instance, like they did with the phone hacking and all this stuff. the murdered newspapers were busy doing these things. So the regulation is there in place to safeguard the public from journalists misbehaving like that. So the government is actually interfering, but not too much. Like in my country, the government respects the fact that freedom of the media is one of the constitutional rights. So you can't interfere in this. There would be a lot of protest if they did. And another completely other thing is how businesses interfere in journalism, but in a different way than how it happens here. So in the Netherlands, for instance, there's not. Of course, the newspapers are owned by businessmen, okay, but they are not into politics. So there's a strict division between politics and business. But what does happen in my country and all over Europe right now is that businesses can influence the media by dragging them to court.
Македонија е една од ретките земји, веројатно, во која што новинар е во затвор поради искажан збор. Како ја оценувате слободата на говорот во Европа, во светот, но и во Македонија во секој случај?
All depends on how you define freedom of press. Sometimes journalists are jailed for hiding their sources, for instance. That also happens in the Netherlands. But they will be jailed for maybe 2 or 3 days, and then they will be released when the authorities find out that they can't get the information from the journalist. So freedom of the press means that journalists are not harassed by the government, not for things that they have done in their capacity as a journalist. So no, I don't think your country regretfully has a freedom of the press like many countries surrounding the European Union. So if I stay within these ethical borders, within these ethical unwritten rules, then I actually can express anything I want. But there is a kind of self-regulation going on in the European press as well, because and journalists are very reluctant to admit this in Western Europe, but they are self-regulating themselves. And one of the things, for instance, they are doing is they are not going hard. They are not investigating too hard into businesses, for one thing, because the big corporations have a lot of money, very good lawyers, and once they start to harass you as a newspaper or a small online media outlet, they can practically destroy you. So this is a kind of self-regulation. So I think the journalists in Western Europe are more scared, if you want to call this, of the businesses, of the large corporations, of the people with the money, than the people with the power, the people with the influence, political influence.
Деновиве во Македонија се актуелни протестите на студентите против државниот испит или екстерно тестирање. Има различни толкувања што ќе биде тоа. Како е тоа регулирано во Холандија и во Европа?
Just before, there is no state exam. Not in the way that you are, that they try to impose on the schools here in Macedonia, but there is another way of regulation, and that is kind of self-regulation by the schools. Not only the journalism schools, but every university and every University of Applied Sciences has to oblige to this assessment, self-assessment. And actually, it's how it works is that one school assesses another school. That's what we do. So the government is on the background. They are not interfering in this. They are not taking the exams, but they trust these schools to assess themselves and to assess other schools, other colleagues. So you have, for instance, the board who is assessing one school consists of people from different other schools. So if we have in Holland, we have, I think, about 8 schools, universities that teach journalism. So 7 of these universities will be in the board to assess number 8. And the state will, every couple of years, they will come into your school and interview the students, interview the professors, and they will have a look around and they will look into all your documents, they will look at your material, your teaching material, and then they will do an assessment and say, listen, is this school still up to the standards or not?
Како да ги мотивираме новинарите да истражуваат повеќе?
One way to motivate them is give them the tools. My experience learned me that from working with young journalists, young people about in their 20s, is that if they're really interested to investigate or they're really wondering about things in their society and they want to know what's happening, if they are curious enough, there is not much that can stop them actually. So curious people, it's very hard to stop them. They will start digging and they will keep on digging, okay? But the thing that goes wrong actually is they start digging, they're very optimistic that they will find something, and then they get too much information, or they are frustrated by they can't find the sources, or people don't want to cooperate with them, don't want to give interviews, and then they stop. So after the first initial enthusiasm to dig into something, they stop because they find themselves overwhelmed or blocked by red tape or authorities, and this is the point where you have to help them to overcome, to get over the hurdle, over the barriers. You can do that by giving them good tools, and by tools I mean very basic journalistic training about how to handle sources, where to find sources. But also, like, there's a lot of software that people could use nowadays to ease their work and make it easier to do journalism. So it's a combination of thinking, intellectual training, and of training with computers. Use your laptops more wisely than just for typing text. That is probably the reason why the fact that it is very American was the reason that UNESCO of the United Nations asked us in 2009, asked Professor Mark Hunter to come up with a manual for starting journalists who don't have much experience in investigating, and also not working in the United States with its press freedom and all this tradition, but working like in the emerging democracies like Eastern Europe, China, what have you, Asia, Africa.
Професор, ви благодарам за разговорот и гостувањето во нашето интервју. Почитувани гледачи, ова беше интервјуто со универзитетскиот професор Лук Senegers, професор на повеќе универзитети во Холандија и низ земјите во Европската Унија.